Emma in Winter by Penelope Farmer. 6. The following morning when Emma woke, the first thing she remembered was what had happened yesterday, but she immediately forgot it again because the next thing she thought, even with her eyes shut, was that something seemed quite different and extraordinary. She opened her eyes very slowly to see her curtains swaying gently in the air, and creeping around and under them, light. But more than light, a sort of goldenness. Was it possible? Could it be at last? Emma hoped desperately, and she leaped out of bed and tore the curtains back, and saw that it was possible. The sun had come at long, long last. Her room and the garden were full of sunlight, and barred with fierce shadows, or at least they seemed fierce, after the long gray light that had no contrast in it at all. The sun was cruel in a way, showing all the tired remnants of snow with its strong light, showing the grayness of the grass under the beech trees, and the crooked, savage scars where the branches had torn off from the trees, and yet it gave even the aged snow a kind of glitter, revealed the redness rising in the trees, and lit every beginning growth of greenness in the garden. And at school it sent the children mad. Some had brought snowdrops from their gardens, and rushed into school immediately to stuff them into jam jars on the window sills. Miss Halibut herself, dripping hairpins and beaming like the sun, stood quietly by the school door, the bell hanging silently from her hands, except when some bold child running past pushed at it, so that the clapper sounded gently one small note. Bobby Fumpkins, walking, bumped into Scooter, running, but Scooter merely grinned and said, "Watch out, Fatty!" "Watch out, Fatty, yourself!" cried Bobby back, and was so emboldened by this that he dared put a little snowdrop in Jammy Hat's back, that he dared put a little snow down Jammy Hat's back, who merely put twice that down Bobby's, but in a most friendly way. And all the children, Emma, Molly, Scooter, Bobby, Jammy, and the rest of them, ran leaping and laughing about in the sunlight, as if they were swimming in sunlight, dabbling and soaking every bit of themselves. They threw up their faces to catch the sun and held out their hands in it, or even stood long moments wrapped and still, their eyes closed like worshippers, letting warmth lie like velvet on their skins. In school itself they talked excitedly about the sun and the snow and about the holidays due to begin quite soon, and hardly worked at all, but Miss Halibut did not seem to mind. Indeed, she sent them out to play a whole 20 minutes early, and read them stories for the rest of that morning until lunchtime. Bobby and Emma went quite as mad as anyone else, and did not talk privately all day, but when Miss Halibut sent the children home early at 2:30, they found themselves setting out across the marshy, half-flooded meadow by the school to climb the downs. They did not quite know how they decided this. Even with the extra half-hour to spare, they knew it must make them late home for tea, but strangely neither of them, not even Bobby, cared. It was almost as if something drove them that was not themselves. The sun by now had disappeared behind clouds. The color had left the land. Indeed, by contrast with the morning, it looked grayer than ever. But up on the downs, the children felt free at last, and the wind blew in their hair and billowed out their clothes, and the gray country reached for miles in a strange, bare way. Its grayness here was beautiful. The grass was patched with unmelted snow like the side of a huge piebald pony. "Like it was in the dream," said Bobby and Emma almost simultaneously as they panted to the top of the hill. And they argued furiously as to which part of the dream it was, Bobby claiming it was for the beginning of their journey, and Emma for later, at the coming or going of the Ice Age time. Soon, however, the air had swept their argument away. The earth even here was so wet that it squelched and spat under their feet, but they spread Bobby's raincoat out upon it and sat down close together because the raincoat was not very large, and for a little while they did not speak at all. Then Emma said, "I didn't know grown-ups ever cried. Did you, Bobby?" No, I didn't. I hated it," said Emma. "I felt awful." "So did I. I hated it too. I threw all those drawings away. I don't know why I did them now. I threw mine away too. I shan't ever do any again." "Nor me," said Emma passionately. "Nor me." And then, after a pause, she said, "And do you know, suddenly last night I remembered something." "I did too," said Bobby. "But what did you remember, Emma?" I remembered who was chasing us in the dream. It was Miss Halibut, at least a sort of horrid Miss Halibut. She had huge glasses and a very pointed nose, much more pointed than it really is, but it was her, even though she was so different. Horrider, I mean. But that's what I remembered too, said Bobby. But she wasn't a bit like the real Miss Halibut. Not a bit like the real Miss Halibut, agreed Emma, with quite unnecessary fervency. It was cold up here in the wind. They huddled closer together on the raincoat, bundling their clothes around them. Yet soon, despite the cold, they fell asleep and dreamed their final dream. Dreaming under the sky for the first time since their dreams began. And not only that, but lying on the downs themselves, where the dreams at first began. This dream itself was new. They moved now so fast that it was as though they were carried in a stream of wind, hardly needing to use their limbs at all, and thus, despite the speed, their journey was less tiring than many had been before. As they flew, they saw deserts replace sea, seas replace deserts, water flowing in and out like enormous tides. There were green seas, brown seas, gray seas, blue seas, calm and wild ones, small and big ones, but every desert burned orange and tawny, their sands ebbing and flowing like water, their rocks shifting like roses back to bud, or like onions forming skin on skin, until suddenly not merely sand or sea, but the whole land seemed to move, to rock like a million cradles. Mountains rose, rocked there and sank back. They heaved up thickly like the bubbles in boiling porridge. But where these bubbles burst, in the boiling, their centers were filled with a white-hot fire, and a heavy liquid melted from the land to flow upward darkly to the bubbles' crests and vanish into these white-hot pits of fire. Emma could make out none of it, but Bobby thought, volcanoes. Those must be volcanoes there. And when the bubbles burst to show the volcanic craters, he could feel a wash of fiery air leap up and hit them as they flew. But they were flying still faster, faster and faster. The land blurred together. Then all sight was blurred. They saw and felt nothing anymore. No seas or deserts or volcanoes, nothing but a tearing blindness. Faster and faster they flew, till they were conscious only of the movement and the clutch of their frantic hands together. And then, all at once, the dream grew still. They were flying as before, but they flew above a mild gray sea toward a rocky shore. And it was they that moved now, not the sky or land. The pallid sea was live, for they sensed, if not saw, a myriad microscopic life close to its surface. The shore, by contrast, was quite bleak and bare, without a living thing upon it, even a blade of grass. And though the faint cloudy sky made its damp rocks steam a little, there was no more movement than that. The shore drew nearer and nearer. At last they glided down upon its steaming rock, their limbs guiding them there unhesitatingly, even if their minds were not conscious of having decided it. Though they stood on firm rock, the land still seemed to move beneath their feet, yet they knew that in reality, and at long last, all was still. In a little while, their senses had quieted enough for them to start looking about them. The cloud-shadowed sea rocked on one side, and the cloud-shadowed rock reached on the other, as far as they could see. Then Emma spoke. All she said was, "Well, Bobby, well," and quite quietly, too, but it startled Bobby as much as if she had shouted that she could see angels or the Garden of Eden, because they had never been able to speak to each other in the dream before. Indeed, there had been no sound of any sort, his ears apparently quite blank and useless to him. And now suddenly, beside Emma's voice, he found he could hear quite other sounds, the whisper of the sea and the shifting of their feet upon the rock, and he wriggled his dry and clumsy-feeling tongue and ventured speech in his turn. "Well, Emma, well," he said, and then, "Goodness, doesn't it feel strange? Doesn't it feel funny speaking in a dream?" For his voice felt and sounded stiff to him, like unoiled, unused machinery. Emma laughed, but shakily. "Ha! Well, you sound quite ordinary to me." Then she asked doubtfully, "Bobby, is this the end of the journey, do you think? Is this the beginning of the world?" "I suppose it must be." Bobby looked round again at the grassless, empty rock with its smoothed-out angles and its shaded grayness. and he was reminded suddenly of the hat shapes his mother bought that were just bald domes of straw until she had covered them over with felt or silk and trimmed them with feathers or with flowers to make her Sunday hats. "Then you don't think," said Emma, "you don't think we could have come to another planet by mistake?" Bobby shook his head decidedly. "No, I'm sure we haven't. It's our Earth, all right, unless the dream's gone cockeyed, unless we're in another sort of dream, and I'm sure we haven't done that." "But I mean, Bobby, what about the garden? The Garden of Eden? Don't you remember we thought we might find it if we got back this far to the beginning of the world? Might it not be somewhere if we looked?" "However do you think a garden would grow here? You need earth and things to make a garden. Trees and flowers can't root themselves in rock." "Don't be silly, Emma." Bobby was impatient with her being so puzzled himself. "I'm not silly. I just don't like this place, that's all. I don't understand why we've come here and what we can do if we have to stay with nothing to eat and nowhere to sleep, and I don't suppose you can either, Bobby Fumpkin, so there's no need to be snooty." But Emma sounded frightened more than cross, and Bobby was ashamed of his impatience immediately. And he said, trying to comfort her instead, "Well, maybe we shouldn't have liked Eden so much anyway. There was a serpent there, if you remember, so perhaps we're better off here," which was only feeble comfort, he knew, but he could think of nothing better than that. He felt suddenly strangely responsible for both of them, and for deciding what they should do, as if, in just this short time of dreaming, he had grown much older than she. But though puzzled, he was not worried about deciding something. Indeed, he felt much less worried than Emma herself seemed to be, and that was stranger still. He could not yet find in himself any kind of fear at their predicament. "Couldn't we just go on flying?" Emma was asking him, "like we did so long before. We never stopped before in ice or swamps or deserts. Why can't we go on flying now? Just back in time, I mean." "But Emma, we don't know what's there," Bobby said, alarmed. "There might not be any world, just space. Nothing but space, and whatever would happen to us then?" And quite suddenly he was calm no more. He was terrified, as if terror had always waited close beneath this seeming calm in his mind. He stared at Emma, but did not see her, feeling for a moment that he stood upon the brink of a dark space. He could sense, quite physically, its darkness in his eyes, and the huge nothingness beneath his body, so that the rock on which they stood, though bleak and comfortless, felt solid to him and friendly, and he shifted his feet upon it several times to prove, without doubt, that it was there. As for the sea noise, he had never known anything so comforting before as to hear its slipping, steady hiss and beat. Then he saw his own fear reflected in Emma's face and dragged himself somehow back to calm. "Oh, well," he said too cheerfully, "I suppose there are worse things than rock after all," and wondered if that sounded as silly to her as it did to him. But she answered him, equally too cheerfully, "Oh, well, I don't want to stay here anyway with just your fat old face to look at, Bobby Fumpkins. We'll explore England and see what's there at least. We don't know if this rock goes on forever. Perhaps we might even find the garden there." "No," said Bobby violently. "No, we must stay near the sea, Emma. We must." Again, he did not know why he spoke so violently, why the terror was streaming back into him. It was as if only the quietness of the sea had power to keep him calm and to contain his fear and bewilderment. And he knew he could not bear to leave it yet, though not understanding why. But he was ashamed to feel like that, ashamed of such fear. So he quieted the violence in his voice and tried to be ordinary and reasonable instead. "I read somewhere, you see, Emma, that all life started with the sea, so if there's nothing here beside it, there won't be anything anywhere. At least we have the sea here, and perhaps we might even find something to eat from it if we were desperate. Seaweed or something like that. I read somewhere that seaweed—" His voice trailed off dismally. Even here he could not feel happy at the thought of eating seaweed. And all at once he felt he was most desperately hungry, whether this was a dream or not, and Emma said crossly, "You always seem to have read something somewhere, Bobby Fumpkins, but I wish you'd read something more helpful for a change, like how to make bacon and eggs out of air, because I'm starving and I don't want to eat seaweed, thank you very much." Yet she looked at him, more friendly perhaps than her voice sounded, because there was nothing and no one else to be with her here. Nothing but the soft, whispering voice of the sea, Sucking and lapping and sighing, they both stood listening, quite silently, looking across at its round grey movings and swellings and sensing the small, shelly life that was there, and Bobby felt calm creep back to him, sealing up his fear again. The silence surrounding the sea sound was extraordinary, he thought. It was like almost a kind of light, and it streamed into every corner of his head and mind. There seemed to be some curious way, quite deafening. His ears themselves felt drained and delicate. The sea noise echoed in each fold of them. It seemed strange on a seashore to hear no seabirds call. At first he missed them, but thought after a little while that perhaps the sea noise itself was enough for ears to bear in this empty half-made world, and that the sharp living cries of gulls would hurt them sorely. Then his ears, half-tuned, caught another sound, a slight one that they might not have noticed in his own world. It came from behind where he and Emma stood, and he turned quickly to see standing there the pursuer, the strange Miss Halibut. He had forgotten her till now, yet knew at once that he had expected her to come. He thought that this could have been why he had sought no way out of their plight, because, whoever she was, she might perhaps show them that. Even so, he was startled seeing her, and the fright started briefly back in his throat, hearing which Emma turned and gasped also, clutching his arm in her fear, and he registered his own calm in calming her. Their pursuer now had thrown away her disguising cloak. She wore pointed shoes like the real Miss Halibut wore, but bigger, and with points on them sharp as swords. She had wrinkly stockings, too, and a longish faded skirt, like a curtain cut down to size, and what seemed like 100 pearly buttons on her blouse, winking if dully in the sunlight, and her spectacles glinted also in the same light, and their lenses were huge as little lakes. Emma cried out, and her voice was sharp and frightened. "Who are you? What are you doing here?" "Yes, what are you doing here?" asked Bobby sternly, like a teacher, he thought, to a pupil, not as now the other way around. "We thought there'd be a garden," said Emma, reproachfully. "But what can we do here?" "Who are you? What do you want?" repeated Bobby. "What about the garden?" insisted Emma, obstinately, hopefully. That this Miss Halibut continued to look at them. Her spectacles glinted, became still huger, her whole face vanishing behind them, and for a moment each lens seemed to contain at its heart not an eye, but a reflected garden, where there were little emerald hills and trees full of golden fruit, with birds flying among them, and the birds were familiar ones, fork-tailed swallows, and flickering scraps of birds, bright as flowers, that the children recognized also because they were the hummingbirds that lived in the glass case in Aviary Hall, though there was no dust on them now. But the gardens were neat picture-book gardens, exact as paper pictures stuck upon a page. They were curved with the curve of the glass and shiny with the glass shine, and both Bobby and Emma were fascinated, drawn in toward them, until each one faded back into a pebbly eye, and they halted, dazed and startled, and now they were rooted to the rock, their feet feeling glued there, or else too heavy for their legs to lift. But Miss Halibut in her turn moved, moving toward them, seeming to grow bigger all the time, her very hairpins large as daggers. Nearer and nearer she came, and with her a scented smell like thyme, yet like summer fruit ripening, that made hunger start in them, set their mouths watering to taste such marvelous fruits. Her spectacles loomed over the children like a pair of skylights reflecting 4, 6, 12, even 20 gardens in a shifting, dancing pattern, until they felt smothered in gardens, choked by the scented garden smell. Emma suddenly screamed, for out of the lenses leaped Miss Halibut herself, reflected by her own spectacles, and so hiding the gardens. Indeed, there was no one but the 20 tiny, vivid Miss Halibuts, curving a little and shiny with the glass, and none of them quite the same. One had teeth like fangs, another ears like bat wings, a third had a pig's nose, a fourth eyes like saucers, a fifth a chin sharp as a knife. Emma, seeing them, recognized them, and then the dream Miss Halibut at last. She screamed again, but this time with words. "You're not Miss Halibut! You're not anyone at all! Not real at all! I drew you, I tell you! I drew you! I drew you! I drew all of you!" The reflected Miss Halibuts faded, but the single figure swelled. hugely, and leaned forward, crushing them. I drew you, yelled Emma. I drew you. You're just a drawing, that's all. A silly old drawing. A drawing, Bobby began screaming beside her. Just a drawing. The figure went on, swelling like a balloon blown up quite slowly, and floating all around it, loose in the air, were buttons big as footballs, with a shine on them like milk. And then, as a balloon bursts, the figure bursts, but with a hissing rather than a bang, and it showered down other figures, fragmented images of people they knew, Miss Gosling and Grandfather Elijah, Mrs. Fumpkins and the baby, Molly Scobb, Scooter Dimple, Jammy Hat, Marley and Bandy Scragg. Bobby for a moment even thought he saw Charlotte there, and all of them were jeering and shouting and falling around them, smothering. They held up their hands to protect themselves from the shower, but where the images touched their hands, they burst like bubbles one by one, until at last 2 figures only stood before them on the rock, where the false Miss Halibut had stood before. They were the strangest images of all. Another Bobby, another Emma, staring at Bobby and Emma. They were both alike, yet quite different too. Threatening, yet welcoming, smiling, yet scowling. It seemed to the real Bobby and Emma as strange and uncanny as it might to look in a mirror at your reflected image that did not smile when you smiled, nor frown when you frowned. The images were much more dangerous and more frightening than Miss Halibut had been, though they looked quite hazy, images only half alive. Their eyes held the real Bobby and the real Emma, who stood staring, rooted and unable to move back and away. They could only move forward to be swallowed up by the greedy eyes of their ghosts, or specters, or whatever they were, yet feeling that if they were swallowed, they would fly there endlessly and never walk on earth again. Bobby never knew what checked him. Perhaps it was seeing the real, blinded, gasping Emma beside him. Perhaps the feel of her hand brushing past his ear. He could not have said, yet somehow he heaved back from the image, and it was like dragging himself out of a powerful marsh. His skin sucked and pulled most painfully, but the real Emma grew clearer to his eyes, and the false Emma more remote, and he looked at the images and shouted with all his strength, "You're not real either, any more than she was real. I'm Bobby and there's Emma. You're not real at all. Not real at all." And with each word it was easier. His body was light suddenly, his skin free. "We're going home," he shouted. "Come on, Emma, come on." She turned to look at him, quite dazed still, but he grabbed at her hands and dragged her across the rock with all his strength. At first, every footstep was like walking through the hardening globe. Walking through hardening glue. But the further they left the images behind, the lighter his feet became, and the less Emma dragged him back, until he was not having to pull at her at all, and they were both running as hard as they could. Go across the bald rock and away from the sea, as Bobby now knew they must, though hating to leave it still. Emma was shouting at him, "We can't go back. We can't, Bobby. There's only space now. You said that's all there was. We can't go back. We can't go back. Stop, Bobby, stop." But her voice was fading until it died away in silence, and there was no sound at all in their ears again, though Bobby saw her still mouthing desperately as she ran. Then they were flying. They could not tell at first what moment the running on land ended and the flying in time began, though for a little while longer they could see the dark rock from which they came. But the light died away slowly, and the rock was blotted out, and they were flying through rain, the most wet, fine, drizzling rain, which in its turn became mist or even fog, as black and quick as smoke, and as acrid to their breath. Emma could not see Bobby at all, only feel his hand still hold hers tightly. But what was fog turned quickly now to steam. It was as if they flew over a saucepan of boiling water, the warmth pleasant enough at first, after the darkness of the rain and the fog, though it made them wetter than ever. Emma's hair was quite soaked and rained down her back. Her clothes wet hung limply around her. But the stream grew hotter, blacker. It was swirling wildly below them. And where it broke, they could see flames, white and blue and orange, and burning molten rock. Then the darkness closed back around them again, like a steely heated box, and the black steam choked them, and the heat was so great that they could scarcely bear it. To escape, they rose higher and higher in the air. But still the heat and the smoke pursued them, and still they rose, and still the heat came too, and beneath them the world burned. Higher and higher now they found coolness at last, and breathed in air again. But at the same moment the movement forward ceased, and instead they were falling faster and faster, like an elevator but 1,000 times as fast. And the faster they went, the more the air seemed to suck down in a vast shaft of darkness. Down and down. Emma had lost herself entirely. She was a little white root thing, falling, no more than that. Not human at all, certainly not Emma. Who was Emma anyway? Her hand alone was still human, flesh and bone and blood, because it still clung to the human hand of Bobby. The hand was Emma's still, but nothing more of her was there. But the hand became aware of more. That other hand tugged at it urgently, that a voice hissed in the sucking air. Think, Emma, like Grandfather Elijah's book. Think of school and home. Think of Miss Halibut. Think of anything, but think. It's the only hope. Emma? Who was Emma? But the hand knew. It sent its knowledge upward, and from its fingers to its palm, up through the wrist and arm till it reached the shoulder, and from the shoulder to the head and to the brain, each place in turn becoming Emma again, or part of Emma, the Emma who lived at Aviary Hall 2 billion years ahead of this dark falling time. And the brain painfully became Emma again and began remembering, thinking about the time so far ahead. The thought of Aviary Hall and Grandfather Elijah and his lock of hair thin as an icicle. It thought of Miss Gosling's beads wobbling on her throat. It thought of school and Molly Scobb and Molly's upright hair ribbon. It thought of Bobby at school, his round bun face and plump slow walk, his comfortable smile and frequent blushing, and the way he chewed his pencil as he worked, as if it were peppermint or chocolate-flavored. It even thought of Miss Halibut, and of Miss Halibut's pearly buttons. Indeed, Miss Halibut's face was almost there in the darkness now, her wispy hair above, her fingers patting down the wisps, and each image, coloring the dark, made Emma more Emma again, even rushing like this, downward, faster and faster. Think, said Bobby's voice, think, Emma, and her mind fastened harder on Miss Halibut, almost loving her if that was possible. Her tapping walk and patting fingers, the quick, kind tone of her voice, because the thought of her thus made so bright and good a hole in this rushing dark. Then again she thought of Bobby scrambling, panting up the slope of the downs, sitting hunched, squeezed on the raincoat, his bulk spreading over the edge of it, and all around him the gray, windy downs, smooth, yet shaped like a huge fish's back. She thought of Bobby, the downs, Bobby again, squeezing the images painfully out of her mind, but almost into the rushing air itself. And quite suddenly she felt a kind of jerk, just a tiny one at first, hardly stemming the fall, but then a bigger one came, and a bigger one still, that pulled her out of the fall so hard that it jarred her bones most painfully. And now she was falling again, but sideways, bump, 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 like falling down a shallow flight of stairs. And at each bump, a fresh image, a black rock, a red desert, brown mud, a clear blue sky, ice green as emeralds, trees, the snowy downs, until there came the largest bump of all, and she opened her eyes to find herself lying on the hard down earth on Bobby's raincoat, huddled against Bobby himself. And she was not scared or wet or bruised as she would have expected from the dream, but stiff from the hard ground and cold from the evening air. And with her coat sleeve all wet where her arm had rolled off the raincoat in her sleep and lain on the soaking ground. Bobby opened his eyes at almost exactly the same moment as Emma opened hers, to find himself as dazed and stiff and cold as she, but more of him was off the raincoat because of his politeness. He allowed her the greater share of it, even though it was his raincoat and not Emma's at all. One leg indeed was wet, almost to the thigh, and there was a dampness down the whole side of him. Yet despite this, his first waking thought was they had not have slept as long as the dream had seemed, the sky, he thought, being not much less light than when they had fallen asleep. And it was only when he heard Emma groan and sigh beside him that, groaning and sighing too, he realized fully that his own stiffness and dampness and cold. Then Emma suddenly was laughing, though even her laughing sounded stiff and strange to his ears. "Gracious, Bobby, you sounded like a wheezy old cow," was what she said, having laughed. "Well, that's what I felt like," Bobby replied, groaning again. But even so, he did not move from where he sat, and Emma stayed quite still and quiet beside him. He wondered what she thought just now, and she said at last slowly, "Bobby, do you think we could have stayed in the dream? In the rocky place? Or with those creatures? Forever and ever? And never got out of it? Do you think?" "I don't know," he said. "I mean, if I hadn't recognized the drawings I did, or if you hadn't read that bit in Grandfather's book about time and thinking yourself in and out of it, as we did just now, could we have escaped? But if we hadn't escaped, then what would have happened?" "I don't know." "I suppose we would have woken up in the end, wouldn't we? We'd have to wake up. Wouldn't we, Bobby?" "I expect so," he said, "probably, perhaps," for he was not sure at all, and in some ways he did not even want to talk about it anymore, because he knew now there was a great deal he could never understand, no matter how hard he hunted in books, and on the whole he preferred things that he could understand eventually. He could feel Emma looking at him, as though she still expected him to have some answers for her, but he continued to gaze sternly in front of him, saying nothing, until at last, to his relief, she looked away again. It was strange how unwilling they both still were to move, though cold and growing colder. The air blew around them, and the grey country reaching away below was live and real despite its colorlessness. Bobby could feel Emma bursting with questions still. He had questions of his own, but less urgent ones, because he was annoyed by his lack of answers. Then Emma said, "We won't dream any more, Bobby, will we?" "Of course we'll dream. Everyone dreams sometimes," he said impatiently, misunderstanding her deliberately, this being the one question he could have answered. Yet he did not want to answer it. "I mean, our dreams, silly. I mean, we won't dream together any more. That was the last time. It's all finished, isn't it?" "Yes, it's finished. We'll dream separately now," he said, but he was still reluctant to say it. "We'll dream separately now. Are you glad?" asked Emma. Yes. Yes, I suppose I am." "It was a horrid dream, really, wasn't it?" she said, shivering a little, but perhaps with cold. "The end bit, falling especially, worse than the dinosaur, I think." "Some things were nice," defended Bobby. "The flying was nice," but Emma added after a longish pause. "But we won't ever fly again, will we? Or do you think we will?" "No, I don't suppose we will," said Bobby definitely, because that was another question he felt he could answer, though why he should feel so certain of that he did not know at all. They pulled themselves stiffly to their feet at last, and Bobby picked up his raincoat and shook it out. Then, without speaking again, they slid back down the hill, trying to avoid the patches of snow that were left. But there was still far more snow left than there was down in the valley, and despite all care, their feet slipped sometimes on grassy or on greasy gray gobbets of it, or skidded on the slippery turf beneath. And then they laughed, steadying each other breathlessly, and grew more alive and yet strangely ordinary feeling each time of laughing. Emma, indeed, even grew excited the further they went down the hill, and seemed quickly to forget about the dream, her cheeks bright with the cold air, her hair bobbing as lively as she changed, or she charged, with her arms out down the last shallowest slope, singing a song Bobby had never heard before, and then jumped about, waiting for him at the bottom of the hill. "Don't you realize, Bobby," she cried quite joyfully, when he nearly reached her, "the snow's almost gone. That means it'll be spring soon, properly, and the holidays, and Charlotte will come home. Charlotte's coming! Charlotte's coming home! She cried, running away ahead of him again across the marshy meadow toward the village. Charlotte! 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 Bobby followed her quite slowly, shouting nothing. He was nearly as quiet and thoughtful as he had been on the hill, not being perhaps quite so pleased about Charlotte's coming as Emma was, though he told himself quite firmly that he ought to be pleased for Emma's sake. He was also wondering if Emma would want to see him any more now. He had been scorned by everyone so long that he could not believe that even she would want to be friends with him, once she had Charlotte for company instead. Emma stood, waiting again, this time by the stream that rushed freely and cheerfully, noisily again after its long winter's silence. She was shouting, "Hurry up, Slowpoke!" and laughing from time to time, hopping up and down again, or else bending to the old snow, which lay still clotted on the bank, and throwing gouts of it into the speedy brown water. Bobby suddenly felt resentful. For no real reason, he thought. She wouldn't notice if I were dying or ill or anything. She doesn't care about me a bit. And he made no attempt to hurry at all. But when Emma said quite kindly and affectionately, "Silly old Slowpoke, what are you thinking about then? Penny for them," he was immediately ashamed, and blushed and smiled, saying to her, "I'm not a Slowpoke. You're just mad, Emma Makepeace. Just crazy, that's all." And though he did not actually hop and jump, for a moment he felt he would like to, for it did not sound as if Emma wanted to stop being friends with him, Charlotte or no Charlotte. The village, like the stream, was full of the sounds it had lacked in winter, the footsteps and chattering, and the whiz and growl of traffic, and the snow that had swallowed up so long. Bobby was suddenly sharply conscious of them, each one echoing separately, distinctly in his ears, and yet together, forming a complete patterning of sound. He deliberately set his own feet down hard for pleasure of hearing them ring out upon the pavement, and without his saying a word, Emma followed in what he did, sometimes stepping in time with him, their footsteps sounding steadily in unison, sometimes to tease, going out of time so that the sound went on clip-cloppeting, unrhythmically disturbing. And thus, busy with their feet and not watching the way ahead, they almost ran full tilt into Marley Scragg, who came running by on her lengthy spider legs. "What are you two up to, then?" she mocked, halting sharply. "You look like a pair of foot-sole soldiers, you do." "Oh, it's just a game," said Emma, a little red, but carelessly. "Silly, really. Oh, Marley." And she was eager again. "Oh, Marley, isn't it super? The sun again. And nearly the holidays, too." "Holidays for you," Marley said, "but I'm a poor working girl, I am. No holidays for me. Well, how's our Bobby, then? Bearing up, eh?" And cackled, watching him. Yet she sounded friendly enough, and smiled quite equally between him and Emma. Bobby could scarcely believe her friendliness, and so was awkward, as he had ever been, blushing and shuffling his feet and muttering something low. "Speak up," Marley said. "Perhaps I'm going deaf or something, but I can't hear a word." "I'm fine, thank you, Marley, fine," he stammered out louder. Marley looked at him hard with her sharpish eyes, and then, surprisingly, winked. She was very good at winking, squeezing one eye tight shut, yet keeping the other quite wide and smooth, winked at him, and then again at Emma, before nodding and cackling loudly again and passing on by. "Honestly, Bobby," said Emma, impatient, but laughing, "anyone would think you expected her to eat you. You are silly, silly old puddle duck." Not long after that, they had reached the bottom of the lane, where Bobby would have to leave Emma. Reluctant as he was, he stood looking at her, not knowing what to say after all that had happened to them that day. "Night, Emma," he said at last, still reddish and awkward from Marley, but trying to be casual and ordinary. "Night, Bob." Emma grinned widely, and did not seem to notice his awkwardness. "See you tomorrow, I suppose, and... Oh, and Bob?" She giggled, wildly, almost idiotically. "Pleasant dreams! Pleasant dreams!" Bobby, hardly noticing himself do it, pulled a toffee from his pocket and put it in his mouth. As the butter sweetness melted on his tongue, he watched Emma turn, still giggling, and run away up the lane, waving her hand occasionally, and she was shouting back to him, "Pleasant dreams, Bob! Pleasant dreams!" And that is the end of Emma in Winter, which was an interesting book. I think I liked that a little bit more than, what was the name of it? The Summer Birds. I don't think there are any more in that series, just Charlotte Sometimes, which tells what happened to Charlotte in the same time that this book took place, which I have read already. But yeah, if you like these, I'll look for more Penelope Farmer books. They're all from 50 years or more ago and are probably all out of print. Emma in Winter was very expensive to get, but I had a really good time reading that to you, and I was glad I was able to do it so fast. Next will be another dog book, and then I will have a short story or something in between, and we will see you in the next read aloud.